The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, in their excellent 2010 booklet, In the Shadow of Death, A Christian Perspective on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, quotes Wesley J. Smith. He said, "As we chart the early years of the new millennium, we are at a crossroads that forces us to choose between two mutually exclusive value systems. Will we remain on the trail that leads ultimately to the full realization of the equality of human life, and with it the tremendous potential for the creation of a true community? Or do we take a hard turn down the slippery slope toward a coarsening of our views of the afflicted, the dying, the chronically ill, the disabled, and those in pain or depression, to the point where we feel they have a duty to die and get out of the way?" Which will it be? We're at a crossroads. Euthanasia, or mercy killing as it's sometimes called, is one battleground when it comes to right to life. Christian Week's senior editor Kelly Rempel reviews some recent developments. She writes, "Death and dying has been at the forefront of some major news in the last few months. Just a few weeks ago, the Quebec legislature barely averted a vote that could have seen the province become the first in Canada to legalize voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The issue is far from over. It will likely be back for consideration in the National Assembly. Meanwhile, in BC, a judge ruled that caregivers must continue to feed an elderly Alzheimer's patient, even though her family says her wishes were always that she be allowed to die should she become incapacitated by the disease." It's an interesting case because she's being spoon-fed, and when the spoon comes to her mouth, she opens her mouth. And to me, that's implied consent. So, yes, I want to live. In Belgium, the government recently legalized euthanasia for terminally ill children. Just the latest in major acceptance of euthanasia in that part of the world. She continues, "These are serious issues with major moral and ethical implications. How do Christians approach death and dying in a way that maintains the sanctity of life, that blesses the last days, that gives dignity to the one finishing their earthly journey? How indeed?"
Pastor,
yes.
Can I just say something about the euthanasia
yes.
thing?
Yes.
Just to kind of, like how, I guess, bad the situation really is. There's actually a woman in Holland who wasn't overly elderly. She was in perfect health, except she was getting macular degeneration, so she was going blind. She wasn't even fully blind yet, and she said to her doctor she could not live with the thought of not knowing if her house and her clothes and her person was clean. So she was approved for euthanasia for that simple reason. So there's no value placed on life when you look at it that way, just because she didn't want to think, oh, my house might be dirty. So they said, yeah, that's okay, we'll kill you.
Even depression, you get qualified that way. So before we look at biblical values that offer light to guide us in these ethically murky waters, let's first define what we're talking about, especially what euthanasia is and is not. Euthanasia, according to the EFC, is an action which directly and intentionally causes or hastens the death of another in order to put an end to a person's suffering, with or without the person's consent, or deliberate killing in order to put an end to a person's suffering, with or without the person's consent. That's what it is. Now, there are several things euthanasia is not. One, allowing a person to die of natural causes is not euthanasia. Thus, euthanasia does not include the decision to discontinue treatments that can no longer achieve their medical goals or are excessively burdensome to the patient. Such action does not cause death. It allows death to occur from natural causes. 2, respecting a person's refusal of treatment or request to stop treatment that is medically useless or burdensome is not euthanasia. Under the current law in Canada, a person has the right to refuse any medical treatment, even life-saving treatment. 3, giving drugs to ease suffering during a terminal illness, even if the secondary effect is to shorten life, is not euthanasia. The intent is different. Intent is very important from a legal point of view. Whereas on the one hand, proper palliative pain care seeks to make a patient more comfortable, euthanasia, by contrast, seeks to hasten death. EFC clarifies, few would disagree that it is wrong to starve someone, However, there is a point at which artificial nutrition and hydration, including tube and intravenous feeding, actually artificially prolongs life and prevents the person from dying naturally. As people come close to the end of life, they often stop eating and drinking as bodily functions shut down. It's the intention behind the cessation of food and water that defines the act as euthanasia. You're actually hastening it, hurrying up to death. Now, there are 4 key biblical principles or values identified by the EFC that govern how Christians should approach this topic. Maybe consider them priceless pearls or treasured truths, principles to value very highly. First, the sanctity of life. Genesis 1:26 and 27 says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. We believe that human beings who are created in the image of God have inherent dignity and worth. Life is sacred and should be cherished. There is no such thing as a useless life, because our worth is not determined by what we can do or the pleasure we experience, but rather by who we are in relation to God and to each other. We believe that human life must be valued, respected, and protected throughout all its stages. Life is a gift from God. All human life, being of equal value in the sight of God, is to be cared for and nurtured physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The Supreme Court has recognized that Canadian society is, quote, based upon respect for the intrinsic value of human life and on the inherent dignity of every human being, end quote. Likewise, the Law Reform Commission has identified the sanctity of life as an essential value. Next, stewardship of life. Luke 12:48. "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." Since life is a gift of God, we believe we each have a unique responsibility for our own life. Our society affirms that we each have a responsibility to manage our lives well. Society also affirms the liberty and freedom of each person to live life as they will. Corporately, our society seeks to provide what's basic and essential to the exercise of that liberty through education, social assistance, and health care. We do this not only to enhance individual freedom, but also to enable individuals to steward the gifts God has given them. We discourage behavior that's destructive to life, be it to one's own life or that of another. Stewardship of life. Next, care for the vulnerable. Luke 10:27, Jesus reiterated the command from Leviticus 19, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Because people are created in the image of God and are the objects of God's love and grace, our lives are inherently valuable. Jesus teaches that we should love others as we love ourselves. In both the Old and New Testaments, the people of Israel and the followers of Jesus are commanded to care for the alien, the widow, the orphan, and the poor. In short, we're to care for the vulnerable in our society. That famous passage in Matthew 25 about the sheep and the goats, Jesus suggested that inasmuch as we serve the vulnerable of our society, those who are in prison, the sick, the least of these, we are serving Christ. When we respond to those who cannot help themselves, we're acknowledging our own dependence on Christ's grace. Communal responsibility in life. After murdering his righteous sibling, guilty Cain protested in Genesis 4:9, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Allison had a beautiful photo on of Silas with his train set out and Jayla plumped down in the middle of the train set. We'll see what happens when Jayla actually gets moving around more. But at this point, there's some sibling bliss there, so that's wonderful. That wasn't happening in Cain's case. "Am I my brother's keeper?" He put him out of the way. Being created in the image of God means that we humans, unlike other creatures, have a unique relationship with Him and with one another. Psalm 139, God calls us into being. Ideally, we're born of our parents' loving union. In Ephesians 6, God commands children to honor their parents. fathers to bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We're raised and nurtured by families and communities. We're not self-sufficient. We live in relation to others as a child, a sibling, a spouse, a neighbor, a friend, a co-worker, a citizen. From birth to death, we live in community and are interdependent. God requires us to be our brother's, sister's keeper and have a measure of responsibility for one another. Think of all the one another passages in the New Testament that Rick Warren talked about. This interdependence gives rise to our various institutions and associations. For example, the legal system recognizes the responsibility and interrelatedness of the community and the person. Likewise, the community's responsibility for the individual is reflected in social welfare programs and provision of medical care. Our actions and how we live our lives affect others. Thus, the death of a person affects an entire community. Those who argue for autonomy in life and death decisions presume a very narrow understanding of life and community. We can't claim absolute autonomy when it comes to the timing and method of our death. Well, those four treasures, four pearls, if you will, keep them hanging around your neck there, something to treasure. Now, answering objections, what are some objections raised about euthanasia, and how can we as Christians answer them? I'll try to summarize a very helpful 5-page appendix in the EFC paper. First, self-determination. Arguing for the right to choose the timing of our own death will become more frequent as a population grows older. People consider life to be their property, to be disposed of as they see fit, without realizing there is an afterlife in which each person gives an account to God for their actions on earth. The Bible teaches us that God is sovereign over our lives. This contradicts the idea that we humans are in control of our lives. It's my body, I'll do with it what I will. God made us stewards of our lives, not owners. In Deuteronomy 32:39, God says, "There is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life." He is sovereign. God's not only sovereign over life, but his sovereignty extends to death as well. The Bible teaches that God gives and takes life. It's not a decision rightly ours to make. The argument about escape from a life of suffering. If it were legal to choose euthanasia or assisted suicide, people might respond to their fear of pain and dying by controlling when and how they die. But with advances in palliative care and end-of-life treatment, pain and suffering can be mitigated, significantly lessened, if not altogether avoided, by medication and treatment. As Christians, we believe that God is able to sustain us and bring us through our suffering. 2 Corinthians 4:17, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Suffering may be real, but in it, God gives us the strength to endure. Sometimes we experience suffering in order that we might give glory to God when He provides a miracle. For instance, when Lazarus died, Jesus brought him back to life. Sometimes God allows us to suffer in order for the growth and development of our character. Chris, with his phantom pain there, must be full of character by now. And sometimes we do not know why we suffer, as Job, who never learned the reason for his troubles, yet God brought him through it. Low quality of life. Today, quality of life is synonymous with autonomous living. Can the person feed and look after themselves? So, babies with disabilities are condemned to death because they would never have a high quality of life. Tiffany and Don, I think it was about 80% of Down syndrome babies, Brenda said, were aborted. 90%. Wow. Yeah, Down syndrome diagnosed babies get aborted without even being born. Some suggest euthanasia for the mentally or physically disabled as well as the elderly. As Christians, we know that all people are of equal worth and value in the eyes of God because He formed each of us and knew us before we were born. Created by God, our lives have intrinsic worth and an eternal purpose. Contrary to those advocating that older people should end their life when they're no longer socially useful or no longer able to enjoy life as they once did, the Bible suggests that old age is something to look forward to. Exodus 20:12. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long. Being a burden to relatives and society. Tendency today is to assert that children have a right to their own lives, and therefore when parents are no longer capable of looking after themselves, they shouldn't become a burden to their children. In general, people are living longer. As a result, there's increased pressure on already scarce medical and social service personnel and facilities. This graph shows the increasing cost of health care, which is kind of sobering there. But in 1 Timothy 5:4, Paul said, if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice. How? By caring for their own family. And so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Yeah, God's pleased when we repay our parents and look after those who are older than themselves. Fifth commandment says, honor your father and mother. This implies some responsibility for looking after them in their old age. God therefore considers it an important role and responsibility for us to care for family members and the needy in society, including the elderly, orphans, widows, and the sick. The Bible places significant value on the elderly because they're to be wise mentors and teachers for the younger men and women around them, not looked at as a burden. The last section, I'm going to skip over what I've got in the outline there. You can always look it up on the sermon online. I'm going to close with this 3-minute video by Faye Sunday. Remember I mentioned in the EFC there, she's one of the lawyers on this back page here. Bright young woman, and just listen to her experience here.
I guess there are two primary reasons. One, I carry the life file at the EFC. And by life, I mean the issues dealing with life from conception until natural death. So I work along with policy issues relating to genetic or reproductive technologies, abortion, euthanasia, and lastly, assisted suicide. Secondly, I've had to personally consider these issues. The issues of sanctity and dignity of life are very close to my heart. I have recently had to face the frailty of my own life and that of loved ones. A few years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I spent 16 months in and out of hospitals, undergoing numerous biopsies, surgeries, and radiation. That was followed by a then unidentified illness, which left me bedridden for days on end, from which I have not yet fully recovered. My mother recently revealed to me that during pregnancy for me, her physician recommended that I be aborted because there was a risk that I could be more disabled. Just last year, on the eve of my being cancer-free for 5 years, my mother was diagnosed with lymphoma. Well, obviously, the reality of abortion really hit home in a new way when my mom told me what she did. As for the issues of euthanasia and assisted suicide, according to the bills that have been frequently and recently been introduced in the House of Commons, which seeks to legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide, I, while ill and sometimes despairing and depressed, would have fully qualified for physician-assisted suicide. That's really sunk in. So these experiences have ensured that I cannot consider the practices of abortion or euthanasia or assisted suicide as abstract or distant, potentially affecting someone else's life. They've affected my own in one way or another. Well, two things really. I wish more people understood the state of law in Canada on abortion. Abortion in Canada is legal through all 9 months of pregnancy. Truly. We have no law regulating it whatsoever. If people don't believe me, which I understand because it's unbelievable, they can Google a piece that Andrew Point wrote from Maclean's a couple years back entitled "It's Time to Talk About Abortion." It explains all of this. and McLean's is totally unaffiliated with the EAC. I also wish that more people understood the difference between a patient's right to refuse treatment and assisted suicide. There's a big difference. Patients can choose to end treatment at any time, and that's fully legal in Canada. This causes a lot of confusion. It's only being fully informed that we can all participate in this national life dialogue, and we need to participate regardless of our opinion. All perspectives should be shared and considered.